Before we begin today's episode, I want to issue a strong trigger warning. This episode will discuss child sexual abuse, institutional failure, and legal negligence. So, if these topics are distressing for you, please take care of your mental health first. I've included mental health resources, grounding techniques, and survivor support links in the show notes. So, please remember that you are not alone, and please prioritize your well being. This is part one of a two-part series on one of the most shocking child abuse scandals in recent history, the case of Joël Le Scouarnec, and how this case is at the pinnacle of a global reckoning. Welcome to About Consent, a podcast that sparks conversations about prevention, healing, and justice to end child sexual abuse, while also creating consent culture now and for generations to come. This is a safe, shame-free, and judgment-free zone where both survivors and those who support survivors are welcome. I'm your host, Rosalia Rivera. Today, we focus on how a predator thrived in plain sight for decades, how those within family and those in power prioritized denial over duty, and why this case echoes others around the world, from Larry Nassar to the Catholic Church scandals, from residential schools to the Boy Scouts and beyond. Today's episode is about the case of Joël Le Scouarnec, a respected gastrointestinal surgeon in France, and he worked in hospitals across the country for nearly 30 years. But beneath his white coat, he was one of the worst serial child predators in modern history. His victims, at least 299 children, many of them were his own patients, most of the time unconscious or under anesthesia, or too young to truly understand what happened to them. Many of them have no memories of the abuse or have repressed memories and have had unexplained mental and physical health issues throughout their lives. Le Scouarnec meticulously documented his abuse in handwritten notebooks, detailing his assaults like if they were trophies. Sadly, 19 survivors are not able to seek justice despite the evidence of their abuse in Le Scouarnec's documentation because of the statutes of limitations in France. Those 19 survivors won't have their day in court. But the issue is not just Le Scouarnec that harmed these survivors. The most chilling part to me is that the system let him do it. From as early as 2004, authorities had warnings. Doctors raised concerns. The FBI flagged him for visiting a dark website featuring child sexual abuse materials. There was evidence mounting. In 2005, he was convicted for possessing such materials, but his punishment was a mere 4-month suspended sentence. And he continued working. Hospitals knew, the French Medical Board knew, the Ministry of Health received reports questioning his moral fitness to practice, and yet nothing changed. For another 9 years, Joël Le Scouarnec walked into operating rooms and continued his abuse with impunity. Let's break down exactly how many times the system could have stopped him and didn't. So in 2004, the FBI flagged Le Scouarnec for accessing Russian child abuse websites. French authorities were informed, and when he was arrested, he claimed that he was in the middle of a marital crisis. He was then released after only 25 minutes of questioning. He was only given 5 questions. And I have to read this to you from the newspaper Le Monde because it explains so much. It reads, convicted in November 2005 and sentenced to a 4-month suspended prison term without mandatory treatment or professional restrictions, he exulted in his journal, "I've slipped through the cracks." So he was very aware. No additional search of his home or hospital office happened at the time. And then the delayed entry of his conviction into his criminal record and administrative oversights in general allowed him to secure a position at a new hospital where in 2006, he would go on to assault approximately 20 more victims just there. So, although some colleagues did raise concerns about his behavior, no disciplinary actions were taken by medical authorities, which enabled him to continue his medical practice without restrictions, in fact, even added to the board. The only mandate that was given was to have another medical professional with him when tending to minors. However, this quote unquote mandate was never once enforced. In 2006, a psychologist and colleague actually sounded the alarm, reporting that Le Scouarnec spoke about children in disturbing ways. They had found out about his record, and the medical board ignored it because the criminal charges hadn't been added to his profile. So Le Scouarnec actually moved to another hospital and then actually told the director about his conviction from 2005. The director did nothing and continued to allow him to treat children, another failure. And then he actually retired with no formal investigation. And it wasn't until 2017 when a 6-year-old girl, his neighbor, actually told her parents that he had been touching her inappropriately in through the fence in the garden. And this actually is finally what led the police to search his home, where investigators found over 300,000 images and videos of abuse. They found detailed notebooks listing hundreds of victims and life-size child mannequins hidden under his floorboards. So this finally came to a head in 2020. He was convicted for raping 4 children, including 2 of his own nieces, and which he received 15 years of prison time, which he's serving now. Now, during that trial, there was another investigation taking place with the findings, right? Because they found these documents. And so now that's what he's on trial for, these 299 rapes and assaults over the last 20 years. Now, as horrific as all of that is, and it's a lot to take in, the case of Joël Le Scouarnec is obviously horrifying, but unfortunately, it is not unique. His decades-long abuse of children under his care echoes some of the most notorious cases of institutional failure to protect children to date. An example, of course, is Larry Nassar, the gymnast doctor. He was a trusted doctor for the USA Olympics and Michigan State University, and he sexually abused like hundreds of young female athletes throughout his career. First reports surfaced in the 1990s, but nothing was done, right? USA Gymnastics covered for him, handling complaints internally instead of reporting him to law enforcement. And the FBI knew about it. They knew about these allegations in 2015, but failed to act, allowing him to abuse at least 70 more girls before his final arrest. Even parents of victims were manipulated into believing his abuse was part of, a medical treatment, very similar to what Le Scouarnec did. So the lesson here is, a well-respected man in a position of authority was protected by powerful institutions, while children who spoke out were ignored. And Le Scouarnec's case, fortunately, this child, the 6-year-old, was believed. But let's talk about the Catholic Church. For decades, if not centuries, Catholic priests have abused children, while the church has systemically covered up the crimes, right? So with thousands of cases worldwide, from Canada to Argentina, France and Germany, Africa to Asia, when priests were caught abusing children, the church often simply moved them to a different parish instead of reporting them to law enforcement. Victims were silenced, sometimes pressured into secrecy by their own families. And the Vatican knew, yet again, chose to protect its reputation rather than the children. So the lesson in this particular case is institutions prioritize self-preservation over justice. And when survivors finally come forward, they're often met with resistance, denial, or even threats. What about the Boy Scouts of America, right? It was essentially known as a predator's playground for decades. The Boy Scouts of America was a trusted organization for youth development, but behind the scenes, again and again, more than 82,000 scouts have come forward with allegations of sexual abuse. 82,000. And they kept what was called perversion files, internal documents that tracked pedophile scout leaders, but ultimately did nothing to stop them. So instead of removing abusers, the organization often covered for them, ultimately allowing them to work with more children. The lesson here is that abuse thrives in environments where adults fail to take action, and the Boy Scouts actively hid evidence instead of exposing predators. What about residential schools? Here in Canada, state sanctioned abuse was allowed. In Canada, the residential school system run by the government and Catholic churches was designed to forcibly assimilate Indigenous children. And from the 1800s to the 1990s, thousands of Indigenous children were abused and taken from their families, placed in these schools. There was sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. It was rampant. Many died, and their deaths were covered up. Survivors who spoke out in these cases were often ignored or have been re traumatized. And the lesson here is that when abuse is institutionalized, it becomes normal. The suffering of marginalized communities is often ignored or buried altogether. Now, not every case makes headlines like Larry Nassar, the Boy Scouts, or the Catholic Church. But child abuse happens every single day and is routinely dismissed, both by adults who should know better, as well as the institutions that protect offenders. Children are not believed. They're told that you're just making it up, or that kids lie about things like that, or he's such a respected man, he wouldn't do that, right? And adults also don't know how to recognize signs of abuse or grooming, right? He might just be a friendly coach, or she's just very affectionate. They're just close friends, and the reality is that abusers manipulate and groom both children and adults to gain trust before abusing them. So professionals need to stop looking the other way. Teachers, doctors, and coaches, if they see red flags but hesitate to report, they are not protecting children. Many people fear legal consequences or career damages for speaking up. Some are actively pressured to stay silent by institutions or ignored altogether. The reality is that mandatory reporting laws exist, but they are not always followed. And the fact is that many professionals prioritize job security over a child's safety. Breaking the silence of the stories of Le Scouarnec, Nassar, the Catholic Church, the Boy Scouts, and residential schools is not just about monsters hiding in plain sight. They are about systems that allow these monsters to actually operate. So we cannot keep asking, how does this happen? Instead, we need to be asking, why didn't adults speak up? Why didn't adults do more? And until we take child safety seriously, we will keep seeing case after case of abusers operating with impunity while children are the ones who pay the price. It's time to stop protecting reputations and start protecting kids. One other piece that I will be watching very closely as this unfolds over the next 4 months is how the family system failed. Because as of now, what we have learned is that his two nieces were sexually abused by Le Scouarnec. And when it was first discovered, the wife of Le Scouarnec said that the niece was lying and discredited her and just said that she was trying to blackmail her husband. But then the sister of Le Scouarnec also didn't go to the police because when she confronted him, he cried and said he would go get help. And so it was never taken to the authorities. And even Le Scouarnec's own father abused his son, and that was also kept a secret, even though the mother knew and did nothing as well. So according to testimony, the mother herself is a survivor of rape by two uncles when she was a child. So this whole family has seen a number of cases within its own family, right? So the issue of intrafamilial abuse is also at the forefront. And that's something that society likes to bury their heads in the sand about as well. But this is definitely something that's being brought to the forefront in this case. His sister also said, if I had understood the harm I was doing by not denouncing my brother, I would have taken action sooner. So perhaps if the family had taken swifter action and brought this to light, perhaps then someone else could have done something to stop this monstrous abuser, right? Now, some cynics might say that even if these abuses were taken to the police, that they might have failed again, or the courts might have failed there too. So no matter what, the entire system is just set up to protect abusers. And I can completely understand this sentiment. I mean, from the family to the police to the courts to the medical systems, every institution decided to look the other way. But beyond the courtroom, survivors and advocates are fighting to change the system. We can't just allow it to continue this way, right? Change can happen. So in my next episode, I'm going to be speaking with Nie Kohiyama, who is a leading survivor advocate in France. Nie's story is heartbreaking in and of itself, but it's also really powerful. She was abused as a child, repressed her memories for decades, and when she finally sought justice, the statute of limitations blocked her case. But fortunately, she didn't stop there. She took her fight all the way to the French Supreme Court, and she helped push France to extend the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse from 20 to 30 years. And she has been working tirelessly for nearly a decade, advocating for the complete removal of statutes of limitations and legal recognitions of repressed memory. So we're going to be discussing what needs to change so that this never happens again, as well as other ways that survivors can reclaim their healing through this process. If you or someone you know is struggling, please be sure to check the show notes for mental health resources and survivor support.
If you enjoyed this episode and don't want to miss the next one, be sure to subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach more ears, please take 1 minute to post a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. Your review helps the algorithm do its thing and reach more listeners. And if you found this useful, share about it on your social channels and tag me at Consent Parenting on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, or X. Let's continue to create consent culture one conversation at a time. Stay empowered.